Um, Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Chitra Mukherjee, and on behalf of Team Chintan and our partners, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, FES, I welcome you all today for the discussion on how our cities can retrofit for circular economy and livelihoods. FES is a non-profit German foundation committed to the values of democracy and social justice. With this webinar series, FES would like to create a nuanced and progressive discourse for social, economic, and ecological transformation with gender justice and climate justice at its core. Today's webinar is the fifth of our six webinar series, and we'll be exploring possibilities of retrofitting cities for circular economy. We talk of making cities sustainable. There are policies and vision documents that talk of this in India. But what is the concept of sustainability? Circular economy could help by focusing on how much resource has gone into the system and how long can we keep that resource within the system. Irrespective of whether one is talking circularity or sustainability, most of these efforts, these conversations have been in silos with little thought to the interconnectedness of different aspects of the city. If Indian cities are to be circular and at some point sustainable, we need different levels of perspective, both macro and micro, wherein different sectors are interconnected and interdependent, and we need to be cognizant of these connections. One often neglected aspect of circular economy, especially in India, is about making it local. This is linked with the way in which the land is planned for, used, and marked. However, local has a strong link with livelihoods for the urban poor, as well as consumption needs for the urban poor. For example, in many Indian cities, weekly hearts or bazaars cater to the low income service providers, but also create livelihoods for vendors. To discuss more on this today, we have our panel. Just to lead you through the format for today's session, each panelist will be giving a brief presentation to share their perspectives, and then we'll open the floor up to give you an opportunity to ask specific questions. The moderator for today's panel is Dr. Ashish Chaturvedi. Dr. Chaturvedi specializes in climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, waste management, sustainable consumption and production, and environmental policy. His current focus is on policy and knowledge management aspects of climate change. Dr. Chaturvedi worked as a fellow in the Green Transformation Cluster of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex and a senior fellow with Adelphi, a German think tank. He led the policy for environment and climate component of the bilateral Indo-German Environment Program. As a senior advisor with GIZ, he advised the Indian ministries and departments and implemented projects in the area of waste or resource management, climate change, and economic instruments. Over to you now, Dr. Chaturvedi.
Thank you very much, Chitra. And you actually read out my entire profile. I should be careful with what I share in the future. But thanks very much. I'm not going to do that with what is shared with me, with the profile of these fantastic speakers we have today. I would actually be doing them a disservice by reading out their lengthy profiles, but rather let them speak because I think that's what they're good at and that's what they're here for as well. As Chitra, you've just said, we're actually going to talk about retrofitting our cities for a circular economy. Uh, and these are sort of heavy terms, right? Retrofitting, sort of circular. It's like how do you retrofit our cities for circular economy? But I think these are issues which are understood in the context of what is being done on the ground. And then four speakers we have. And incidentally, three of them are engineers of some sort. So I think it would be good to hear from them. Uh, our sort of lead speaker, person who's going to kick us off is Mr. Kunal Kumar, who's currently a joint secretary, but also in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, as well as the mission director for the Smart Cities mission of the Government of India, a flagship scheme of the Government of India. And I would claim to know Mr. Kumar a little bit sort of because he was the commissioner of the city of Pune, and I remember being on a panel with him while I was at University of Sussex, and we spoke together at the Niti Aayog talking about circular economy at that time as well. So it's interesting to actually, well, it would be great to hear him 4.5 years down the line on what he thinks about circularity and given his new role as well. So over to you, Mr. Kumar. You have 15 minutes, and we know that you have to leave at 6 p.m. So we might actually sort of ask the audience to ask you a couple of questions before you leave. All right. So over to you, Mr. Kumar.
Thank you, Mr. Chaturvedi. In fact, I remember that meeting in Niti Aayog. It was a jamboree of a lot of people there, um, and that's how it is. A lot of talk happens, and I'm sure some of that leads to action also. It's fantastic to be part of this panel. Thank you for inviting me. If I'm audible, perfect. Okay. Uh, I was delving on the topic retrofitting our cities. To me, it almost seems like an invitation to reimagine, uh, rethink, and redraw the way we think and the way we implement and the way we act in cities. And I think a lot of that is going to happen in the future. All said and done, how many new cities or how many new habitations are going to create? You're going to retrofit. You're going to make existing cities and habitations better. That's going to be the way forward. And therefore, I think all the programs of the government of India and the state governments and all the efforts that are going to happen in the cities themselves are going to be focused on doing just this. And so this is a very relevant topic. Not only now, I think it will be relevant at least in the next 2 to 3 decades to come. Uh, I mean, when I was talking to my daughter the other day, she said they were doing some course which there was a project on, and she said, there is no planet B. She was mentioning Elon Musk, and he was saying that he's trying to set up something in Mars, and said, well, that's not yet happened, and there's no planet B that we have. And so, what are we doing with planet A, which is the only planet that we have? Well, there's always this seemingly existing conflict between societal goals towards economic development and social development and climate goals. And even though there are a lot of nuances in that debate, it generally gets over, and in favor of people who want development at any cost. And that's fundamentally the root cause of this problem, because I think everyone now realizes that climate is one of the most important things that should be addressed in everything that we do, but it just doesn't get the priority because unless we get a shock ourselves, we're not ready to change our own consciousness, and that's how it plays out. So use of fossil fuels is going up, energy use is going up, GHGs is going up. There was a circularity report which Davos comes out with. I think 2020 says that the world is 8.6% circular. It used to be 9.1% circular in 2 years back. So clearly, we're not moving ahead according to that report. We're actually going behind. And cities is most important because 60 to 80% of this happens in cities, and India is no different, the world is no different, everywhere it's the same, and in smaller big proportions. 80% of sort of urban GDP also comes from coastal cities. So it's not only that cities are going to be the creators of this mess, they're also going to be the consumers of this mess, and the world will be at a loss because of that happening. What is happening in India? You've seen about 7% decadal growth. All estimates and all good research points that the next 2 decades, 90% of the urbanization is going to happen in India and Africa. You're going to see at least 70% of what is built today added on. 70 so 2030, India's whatever built up area is going to be, 70% is still to be developed. You're adding a Chicago every year. You're going to add population of the size of America in Indian cities. And today, what is it? I mean, today you have 2 people, so 10 people for every 10 cars for every 100 people. You have a lot of plastic waste generation. I have some figures like 25,000 tons of plastic is generated every year, every day. And so much of loss happens because there is no value which is being generated. It's a loss to the exchequer, of course, but also loss to climate because there's no circular economy of note which exists in these spheres of activity. And then the question comes as to why don't people, really look at circularity or sustainability in a holistic way? Uh, I think it's never been a practice. If you see cities, climate governance has never been a practice. So one of the challenges we are trying to solve from the smart cities mission is to see how we build this practice in a localized manner, in a manner in which co-creation and collaboration at the local level happens between various partners. People who are mindful of the climate lens on development. How do we come together on one platform? So talking of sustainability, I think of it as a dynamic equilibrium. It's a very simple thing. Even if you drop a pin or you do something today, the way you have traveled from your office to your work or to your house and back, the way the things you've bought, the things you've used, everything contributes to sustainability. And this only magnifies when it's happening in cities, because the every street light that you put in place, every road that you build, every transportation choice that you make, every health or education choice that you make actually affects the sustainability in the long run. Circularity, I think the best way to, I have seen best way to make people understand is by saying it's waste to wealth. And wealth becomes waste, and waste becomes wealth, and that's how it becomes circular. I mean, this is the way most people understand. And so it's actually a dynamic thing about the ecology, environment, and sustainability, everything coming together. And funnily, I was in a conference some days back where they were debating whether a brush with a plastic handle or a brush with a wooden handle is more environmentally sustainable. Because if you have a plastic handle, there's plastic. If you have a wooden handle, you're cutting wood. And this kind of debate is just a reflection of how this is not a really resolved issue in the minds of people, and therefore a lot of deliberation needs to happen. Uh, no, the deliberation needs to happen, and probably a lot of education and awareness at all level needs to happen, that it's a systems issue. It's not a individual issue where we can say that it's basically a climate issue, and the climate issue is a siloed issue where everything else you do is fine, but you just take care of climate at the end of the day. Everything else that you do in small or big ways affects climate. So it is a systems issue, whether it is a decision on transport, with decision on water, a decision on how your children go to school, how you travel to office, everything. So how do you enable systems thinking at all levels, at the societal level, at the organizational level, at the city level, at the federal level, is the crucial bit, I think, which is very, very important. The second thing is, while we be strategic and we talk of the big things like electric mobility, we talk of regeneration of energy in so many different ways, using renewable sources of energy, and moving towards solar and wind, and reducing, going towards planning which is mixed use, mixed income, dense planning, which is more agile in nature and is not very static. While we talk of these big things, and we try to infuse them into our planning systems, it doesn't happen easily, though it really happens easily in our mind, because there is a lot of granular difference in the way things happen in cities, and the capacities that cities have, the way they have evolved, the kind of exigencies they deal with, the kind of aspirations they have, and so it's going to take time. And therefore, there is probably no shortcut. There's no pill that can be consumed and you will get healthy planning happening the next day. It has to go through its bumpy ride. And I think over the last 3-4 years, because as you said, you met me when I was in Pune. That time I would consider I was a player in the market, and now I'm a coach in the market as a mission director. And I can see I've been in the urban space for the last 15 years. 2005 was when the JNNURM was launched. I was a municipal commissioner then in Kolhapur. Before that, I was in Nagpur, and then I went to Pune, and then I'm now here 2.5 years. So I've seen things evolve, and the insider view gives me a lot of hope over the next 2 decades, because clearly the last 2 years, the way our cities are maturing, and when I say cities, it's not only urban local bodies. I'm saying the entire collaborative brilliance of the ecosystem is maturing to understand these issues. We are doing this climate smart cities assessment framework. So we launched this framework so that everyone understands in very simplistic ways of how each aspect of our governance and practice affects climate. And I have been talking to NGOs. The other day, I was talking to an NGO in Mira Bhayandar, and they were very excited about it. And they say this is a great forum that is being formed where all of us local action oriented community organizations can come together and engage with the cities to create some meaningful action. When we started the climate smart cities assessment, we started as a government initiative as we do, but now today I'm happy to tell you that we have more than 50 global partners who are working with us. When I say global partners, they're not working with us from Sweden or America. They're actually working with us in cities. So C40 is there in some cities, ICLAI is working in some cities, GIZ is working in some cities, some of you may. And that's how we are trying to bring the brilliance together. The guiding strategic input comes from the Paris Agreement, and subsequently it boils down into India's commitments, and then subsequently then into our own urban commitments and so on. So focus on mixed use, mixed income as far as planning goes, local area planning, form-based codes, how much you can get in there, how much you can gradually make space for this kind of planning in the ecosystem. How can you be more decentralized in the way planning is done? I mean, today's plans are mostly approved at the state levels, and so how can you become more decentralized? How can you become more dynamic with your planning? If I remember one night when I was in Pune, 2 a.m. in the night, we're trying to evacuate. This has happened so many times. 2 a.m. in the morning, some heavy rain starts at 10 in the night, and by 2 a.m. you are in a slum trying to evacuate people because water is rushing in. There's a 44-kilometer river in Pune, so Muda Muta River. So all the time, this thing, if we had more liberty to do local planning, probably these things could have been settled by really rehabilitating the people in a way. There is economics behind it, and economics always works out provided there's a choice that you have built in the system. So it's about coordinating, collaborating with local community organizations, education, but more than that, incentives, building the right incentives for taking the right decisions. I mean, the same person behaves differently in two different incentive structures, and so how do you make the incentives? One way of doing Swachh Bharat could be that you propagate and have dialogues. Other way could be that you build the right incentives that Swachh becomes the best thing to do. And if you don't be Swachh, there's certain thing in society which doesn't work in your favor. These could be economic incentives or some other incentives. Of course, decentralization and building adaptive capacity of cities is a long-term action plan that India has to build. I don't know how that's going to happen. It's been very gradual. It's easier said than done. Always, there are times in a country's lifetime. I think COVID has given us one good example of that one time which actually creates creates a good opportunity, a window of opportunity of making a big inroad into that. So I don't know. I mean, the next 2 years could possibly be a great win-win for everyone who wants to champion decentralization. Then, of course, tactical initiatives are very important. So streets for people, one initiative we launched only 2 months back. We're pushing cycles for cycling cycles for change. There's another program that we launched called Eat Right. There's a program on the anvil called Tech for Mobility. We're trying to see how we can use more tech in enhancing the quality and reducing the GHG potential of mobility. The smart cities mission at the moment, split in 100 cities, is doing about 25,000 crores, which impact climate in some or the other way. And we are in the business now with the climate smart cities assessment. Gradually, I think over the next 6 to 8 months, we will have a dashboard where people like you and me all can see together as to how much we have moved the needle on climate sensitive development. So that will be a big bonus. You can, for research, for people who want to collaborate, that's going to happen. But Swat Sarvekshan, and stuff like that. We've recently formed the C Cube, which is the Climate Center for Cities at NIUA. And that's for the first time that we've recognized that we need to have an institutional backup and a strong research facility come up in India on climate issues. And I see that growing into a big organization going forward and working. When I say big, it's not going to be a big national level organization. It will be a big federated organization with multiple chapters across the country, with multiple partners across the globe and local partners to drive this agenda forward. And then on livelihoods, since I've been in Pune, I know that A tremendous change comes by involving the informal sector in the local in the circular economy. The Swachh initiative that we had, the Swachh cooperative that we built in Pune, and then MACARTHUR and so many other cities have actually involved the informal rack pickers and many other people in this business to actually set up a win-win for sustainable livelihoods as well as the circular economy, both coming together. There is clear economics which says that creating bike lanes actually creates more employment than creating metro systems. And bike lanes are regenerative and also adds to the employment. Also with circular economy, there's multiple different kinds of businesses which come in. So how much the sky is the limit. I mean, if you see the new jobs in the area of energy, biomining, segregation, solar energy, wind energy, so many new jobs can be created. And the localization is very important. I mean, tomorrow if you have a solar system, you want to your city wants to invest a lot in solar system, but you don't have solar system building capacity within the city, then you will struggle at least to, if not to bring the capex, but at least to maintain it. So you need to invest in skills, and skill building in these areas is essentially very, very important. This is not going to happen only by the government. I remember a mission initiative called Kushal by the Builders Association in Pune, where they train local people to build housing which is more climate oriented and things like that. So these are the kinds of initiatives that need to happen by every cross section of society. And so maybe shared economy. So that's another area where the jobs will be created. Now, as the mission director of smart cities, you always think, so here's the guy who is going to really push all this. Look, we work in a federal system, and I think dialogue is the best way in which all this can be driven. If we become very transactional, say you do this and this, and you'll become economy which is very sustainable. By doing this and this, what happens? 20 years back there was a BRT lane which was built in Pune, where the condition of the funding was that unless you make bike lanes, you will not get money for BRT. What happened was they made BRT lanes with cycle tracks, just the cycle tracks, because of the conditionality, and the cycle tracks never got used. So you cannot have a top-driven agenda where you say that you do this and your city will transform. It has to be local agency. It has to be decentralization. It has to be local adaptive capacity, local brilliance of all the ecosystem partners, and that comes only through dialogue. We at the central government are trying to do that in both tactical and strategic ways. I think I'm very optimistic on the scenario 5 years down the line. I think the way we have started, we talk of today of Amsterdam being a city with 25% transport being cycling, but look, 30 years back, it was a car city. It transformed. It took 3 decades to transform. We would also do it in maybe a lesser time, but it'll take us time, and we'll move there. I think all of us in this conference, and maybe outside this conference, the huge ecosystem that is working in the urban sphere in the country is all guided by these aspirations, and so I see a lot of optimism and hope going forward. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I think you've actually compressed a whole lot of your own journey, but also of urban development in India in these 15 minutes. So thanks very much. Of course, fantastic initiatives with the C Cube, the setting up of the C Cube, the Climate Smart Cities framework, also the work that you've done in Pune with Swachh. I think these are landmark sort of achievements, and I think really interesting developments. And I think a lot of people who work in the urban areas would share your optimism. uh, as of course you're calling yourself a coach, and I think a lot of people who are working with you do seek that kind of inspiration from people like you. uh, I'm tempted, of course you have just 5 minutes, but I'm tempted to take at least one question so that you can respond to it before you leave. uh, and this is a question which has just appeared in the chat box. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I'll just read it out very quickly. It's from Pradeep Saha. Uh, from an organization called Damage Control, very interesting name. So it says this is a well-planned. There is a well-planned focus on urbanization. We are proud to announce that by 2050, almost 70% will be urban population. However, he says that there is a reason for this. Urban per capita material use is very intense, more consumers per square kilometer, and this is exactly the reason for linear, outdated economic growth. So he's saying if we are really talking about aggregate circularity of our economy, shouldn't we be talking about deurbanization? Well, interesting. Of course, you've already talked about, you started by talking about reimagining. He actually has reimagined something else. So,
He actually has reimagined. No, no, it's great to have this debate. I think, the same debate would have happened when humanity was moving into the agricultural revolution. And the same debate has happened when we moved into the computer revolution. And the same debate happened when we moved into the AI revolution and all the industrial revolutions that we talk about, whether the previous one was better than this one. I think we are free to talk, but ultimately, the way habitation is shaped is basically a function of the technology of the times. And so you and I may think that 2050 the scenario will play out, but it never know because there's so many variables. All it seems that this thing about um, what urbanization should be like, whether we should de-urbanize or urbanize or move ahead or go back. I don't believe in getting into these debates. I believe in reacting to the way things emerge, and that's why I say when I say that um, our cities should have adaptive capacity. So tomorrow, even today, a Detroit kind of city in some time was de-urbanizing, and a New York kind of city was urbanizing. So it's not that one thing plays out in all cities. So it's the adaptive capacity. If cities need to understand the local needs and aspirations and the technologies they have at their disposal, and if they are adaptive enough to use them and
seem to have lost
harness
your
them,
audio. Ah, now we can hear you. Yes.
if they are adaptive enough to use them and harness them, I think they will be able to chart the course irrespective of how it plays out. So let's build systems which are adaptive to adopt their strategies as things play out, because all of us, even the best philosophers and the best astrologers for that matter, will never be able to predict things in the best way, in the most accurate ways. So I think this debate is basically inconsequential. We have to be ready for the kind of eventualities that we face in the future. And of course, if you're seeing influx of populations into cities, if you're seeing influx of populations into urban areas, then you better be prepared for it. I mean, there's no point in debating whether we should de-urbanize or urbanize because it's happening. It's the debate. That is not going to wait for your debate. And till the time that is happening, you have to be adaptive enough to be able to deal with it. So that's how I look at it.
All right. No, I think what you just said earlier as well, and the idea that how do you deal with sort of enhancing this sort of resilience of cities, adaptive capacity of cities, trying to minimize the material reuse. So I think this is there is one space for that debate, but the other space is to deal with reality, and maybe sort of there are different communities of practice who are working on different topics, and I think that's what sort of we see. So thanks very much. We're actually 17:59. So thanks very much for coming in. It was brilliant to hear you, brilliant to see you again. And yeah, more power to people like you who are working to sort of move our cities in the right direction. And also more power to sort of the initiatives of institutionalizing climate action in the urban space, because I think that's going to be the critical game changer going forward. So, and of course, as
Thank you so much. It's been an
delighted.
absolute pleasure, and more power to all of us. In fact, all of us have to work together. And I'm indeed very grateful to be part of this conference. Thank you so
Thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, so then let me just then move on to Dr. Prasad Modak, sort of an old sort of acquaintance, I would say, of and who's been working tirelessly on this issue of environmental issues, sustainability issues, for the last several decades. Uh, he's currently the president of the Environment Management Consultancy, and well, he holds many roles. I know him also as a member of the India Resource Panel, which was set up by the Ministry of Environment and Forest, looking at resource efficiency and circularity issues. He runs a summer school on circular issues, so he's quite an expert on these topics. And we would really be grateful to you to hear from you about what's happening on the ground in India. Of course, looking at sort of critical issues, challenges. We've already heard from Mr. Kumar about sort of what the government is doing. But as someone who's an independent expert who's been working in this space, would be good to hear from you about experiences, your experiences of working in the cities, and also what are fundamental challenges that we are facing in driving the circular economy agenda in the urban space. So over to you, Dr. Modak. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ashish. Am I audible? Great. So, good evening to everybody, and thank you for inviting me today here to speak. I'm going to be sharing a few slides. If it is okay, I will just share them and then take you through. Just let me know, Ashish, whether my slides are visible.
They're visible now, Dr. Modak. Yes.
All right, thank you. So the topic of, I think, today's discussion is how can our cities retrofit for circular economy and livelihoods? And I thought in this presentation, just to pick up only few points, to just air what I feel about this topic. And I'm going to stick to some of these different perspectives in some sense. They all are very intimately linked to the interest on circularity in cities. So I'll talk a bit about the very first basic things we need to do is to arrest the leakages of resources. Resource efficiency is the next step, but just working on how do we minimize these leakages, water, food, energy, that will be my first point. Then we already have seen a big surge in the digitalization in most of the activities which we do. I think in the COVID-19, we learned even much more. We were compulsively using digital platforms. And there is an increasing role I see of digitalization in circular economy in cities. So I'll talk a bit about that. We've been always talking about green buildings. And that's a topic which is, I think I would say, agencies like CII and TERI have come up there different schemes for rating for greenhouses or green buildings. But I think one area which we haven't looked at is how do we promote refurbishing of our built structures, and how do we bring in their mechanisms to address it? Because if you look at the urban metabolism, we will see certainly increasing quantities of debris from demolitions and new buildings. The green buildings is one part of it, but even how can we refurbish our housing, our build structures for better resource efficiency? That's something which I'll talk about. I heard Kunal talking about shared economy. It's very important. So the fourth point would be collaborative consumption and its role. Often circularity is taken equivalent to waste recycling, which is very limited perspective. All of you know it's much more than waste recycling, but we need to discuss waste recycling a bit when we are talking about also the informal waste pickers and the livelihoods. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll end with going upstream in the life cycle of the subject of circular procurement. So that's how my structure will be, and I'm going to be brief, Ashish. I will not cross maybe 12 minutes, be within that, because I think we need to have more time for people to ask questions and discuss, right? So all my slides are graphics, actually. There's not much text you'll see. If you look at the top left on the food waste itself, and this is a global estimate. It's an estimate, of course. I'll call it a guesstimate, but still, it's big, 10%. And the food waste in our cities today, if you take a wedding city like Jaipur, it's huge. And then there has been an interesting response. Many of you know that we have now many foundations working where they pick up the excess food or wasted food and then package it to reach it to those who are not getting enough. And since I mentioned to you just now, Jaipur, many of you know Annakshetra Foundation was one of those early institutions who started organizing it. So my first point, as I was talking about stopping the leakages, I think we got to work on how do we reduce these leakages, for example, in the food waste. Energy losses, huge, happening already. And I'm going to add here also the element of demand management. And many studies and then some of the work which was done in Mumbai, we found that the energy was in not realizing was excessively used, and there were significant energy losses. And if we looked at them as well as what you see on the right, the water leakages losing huge quantity amount of water in our delivery systems. So we're talking about losses even more than 30 to 40%. And there are even more in some cities. So let's look at this as a first action point. Stop the leakages. This doesn't need too much of discussion as much as a priority. It's just the priority that we have to give when we want to look at these flows of water, energy, and food. I was talking about digitalization. And if you look at the life cycle, today digitalization in the circularity is playing a huge role almost in every life cycle stage. And there you must have seen that there has been an emergence of waste aggregators using digital platforms. And we have many success stories right from the early Kabadiwala Connect in Chennai, and then you have Banyan Nation actively engaged in the city of Hyderabad. You have Recycle company spelt with K, which is doing a great job on such digital platforms, connecting waste pickers, waste generators to the aggregators, and then therefore building a value chain. So I see a lot of application, increasing application when we want to talk about the circularity in our cities, because we are one of those few unique countries where informal sector has a big role to play in circular economy. And you would see that happening not just on the recycling part, also on use consumption. We'll talk about it a little later. And I think this is a opportunity, I would say, that we have to take, look at it from the point of view of moving forward towards circularity. Now, repair and renovation is also actually an element to extend the product life when we talk about products, or even when we put that back to a better use, we are actually doing more resource recirculation. And if it done rightly so, then you can also strike how do you minimize the generation of the demolition waste itself. And Ashish, you may remember for GIZ, when I was working, we worked on the construction demolition waste. In fact, we came up with the standard bid documents. And then how do you do clever demolition so that you minimize the generation of debris in the first place? But what is important, if you look into the right part of this slide, the housing, which is dilapidated at a very poor level of resource efficiency, losses in resources, could they be given some way of incentivizing to go for renovation? And you find that trend happening a lot in other countries. UK, I would say, is one of the great examples. Northern American countries. Vancouver is a great example. Now, here, what we're talking about is coming up with schema financially so that people find it is a good idea to renovate by building on the loan and saving on your operating expenses. Now, this hasn't come through, correct me, Ashish, but it has not yet come through in the country. We don't have funds set up. We have affordable housing. We have in smart cities such kinds of programs as well on the housing infrastructure. We have programs which incentivize green buildings, but we don't have funds where you and I can look at our houses and offices and renovate in the interest of improving our resource use efficiency. So this is, I would say, is a very important priority which we haven't been discussing and haven't yet experimented much. We talked about collaborative consumption or shared economy. I think this is a kind of an interesting trend you see where in circularity, the PaaS model or the product as a service model is catching up. And you see that evidence already, say toys. We have company called Khilonewala, which is running in 22 cities, a toys library. So you don't buy toys, but you rent a toy for your kids because that toy is not going to be of great interest to the kid. That always happens after a while. And what do you do with that abundant of toy? So Khilonewala is a great example, but then you have many such cases. Even if you look at outside India, the library in London, the library of books, as it is called. Carpooling, yes, I don't know, it may be hit a bit because of the COVID scare at the moment. But it is a very important area for promoting carpooling in the interest of reducing emissions. And some people even say, they argue that it's got a great social benefits of talking to people, not to be forgotten. We talked about food waste earlier. So that's again a collaborative consumption if you want to pass on the food waste. And the whole slogan is what is mine is yours. And that's the kind of a thought process that you see more of collaborative consumption examples. And we have these Airbnbs and equivalents we have already in India. That kind of a business is a way ahead where we look at more and more of shared economy. And this is where I would say it also is a very important area that you do a better asset utilization. So the whole leasing models which have started, even in vehicles or construction equipment, are examples that you're trying to use the asset to the fullest extent you can. And when you bring in product as a service, you are actually in many ways touching on the use and end of use phase of the life cycle by long-term maintenance contracts, and also ensuring that the product stays refurbished. And there are very many examples, very interesting ones. One of them, of course, talked about, it's called bundles, which is in the business of washing machines. Bundles makes washing machines from a company which is into sustainable production, big time. Miles is the name of the company. But then when they deliver you a washing machine, they look after the washing machine, they take back your old washing machine. They provide you spare parts, and not even that, they coach you how to use the washing machine correctly. Imagine the entire circular system being put, right from making it, delivering it, taking care of it in the use. And these are the kinds of business models, Ashish, I feel they will become more and more popular, especially in urban areas where you have both husband and wife, double income families, not much time with them. They would really look for such kinds of services. And that's an opportunity. Net, apart from opportunity, it's helping us to move towards circularity. When I was talking about my earlier slides, I didn't use the word retrofit, but they were all retrofit oriented interventions, which I was trying to talk about. Now, the downstream part, which you see at the end of life part of your products, you have all these streams of plastic and the metals which need to be sorted so that they get into some value chain. There is no denying that our entire circular part of that segment or closing the loop part depends so much on the informal sector. And we have to, of course, Swachh is one of the models Ashish you mentioned just now, which was earlier the Kagaj, Kapda, I forget, Kachra, I think KKKP is what I remember. Then to Swachh.
KKPKP, yeah.
Yeah, that led to Swachh, right? But you don't see that getting replicated in many cities. It's a great work which happened that time by, in fact, by economists who were involved in getting that into a agreement between the corporation and the informal workers. But what we're looking here is health and safety, livelihood, and dignity. All three elements, we do have these very laudable initiatives happening, but we have to see why we don't see them getting replicated. I think sometimes people say market linkages are so important, and you do have some initiatives there like the UNDP, Hindustan Coca-Cola, Unilever. You have the WOW program of ITC happening in many cities, but the sorting centers will have to graduate to upcycling. While at the same time, apart from health, safety, livelihood, and dignity, we got to be also consciously aware what risk of recycling. And that takes us all the way to upstream. What kind of chemicals are we using in making our products? What kind of recycled content in the product is acceptable or not? So these debates, these needed standards and policies have to be in place if we are looking at the interests of the recycling community. And how do we protect them, nurture them? How do we build entrepreneurship with them? These are interesting ideas for, or I think we have to work on it so that how could that happen? The last point of going upstream is role of green public procurement. Now, we do have a lot of interest in the subject of sustainable public procurement. In fact, I am on one of the committees of Ministry of Finance where we are formulating SPP related guidelines, and a piloting is under discussion with Indian Railways, which is one of the major public sector procurer. Some studies have been done and looking at how could we introduce it for paper, air conditioners, cleaning chemicals, very important now that we are using them substantially in the COVID times, the sanitizers. Many cities, I mean, if you look at it, our maturity on the sustainable public procurement in our country is very low compared to several neighboring countries. We haven't leveraged on that because to us, circular economy is more on recycling still. We haven't really looked at how do we connect ourselves upstream, right, in the product procurement stage itself. So cities, I've been working collaboratively in Europe, for example, and networks of cities who come together and then they go for a sustainable public procurement program and focusing on few products. I just listed three here, but there could be more, and I think that is the way for us to go. So we are all in that transition. I think all of us here are optimistic, I could see, and therefore we want to look at that transition, leveraging on what we are talking. When we say what do we mean by smart, again, there's the issue, is circularity assuring sustainability? Many people say no, because it doesn't look at resource sufficiency. It talks about resource efficiency. But there's something different when we say resource sufficiency. So we can't call circular economy as a silver bullet, but it's something which is most relevant to our cities. As I said earlier, there are different phases of metabolism, and it's very important that if you want to retrofit, therefore, coming back to the main topic, this is a very important instrument that we all must look for our way ahead. So thank you, Ashish. I'm stopping here. I hope I'm in my time limit. Thank you once again. Bye.
No, all very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Modak. And of course, very important ideas in your slides and in your presentation, especially this entire idea of thinking about sort of circularity as sort of one model, which is or one approach which can reduce the potential footprint, the resource footprint and the material footprint and the carbon footprint of cities, but it's not necessarily the silver bullet. It's not going to transform our cities in a way that we actually completely change the model of our urbanization. So I think there are other complementary approaches which we need to talk about and think about as well. and especially this idea of a shared economy. We've had a tradition of sharing, right? So sort of a lot of people who live in North India would, and especially those who sort of know sort of Punjab, would know about the shared kitchen, Sanjha Chulha. Na? It was a shared kitchen. The entire community would share the kitchen, and they would cook together. And of course, the clothing banks, the informal sort of clothing, exchange your clothes for utensils. That's still fairly active in parts of India, and even in sort of settlements in Delhi. One could even see wasted like old rotis. So the discarded roti from one day to another, people actually collected to feed the kitchen, the chickens, as well as the poultry, as well as pigs. So even that is sort of used in our sort of parts of the sort of society. So I won't subject you to the questions immediately. We have two more speakers. So I would like to move on to Mr. Dunu Roy, who's well, sort of who's very popular in certain circles, who doesn't need too much of an introduction. And Dunu's biography is fairly interesting, so I would actually read it out. I haven't done it for others, and especially mine was really terrible. So, well, Dunu says he's past 75. He's a chemical engineer by training, social scientist by compulsion, and a political ecologist by choice. Um, and He's basically worked for over 5 decades in rural and urban scenarios, land and water management, secure settlements, and sort of working on the delicate borderline between environment and development. So, thanks very much, Dunu, for your sort of articulation about yourself. Over to you. If you could switch on your camera, that would be useful. Oh, yeah, you have already switched on your camera and you're looking nice and sharp. So over to you and for 15 minutes.
Thank you. Uh, Thank you. It's rather intimidating. I actually always feel intimidated when I'm on panels like this. Prasad is an old friend, but he and I have always had differences of opinion on many subjects, but we argue them in a very friendly manner. So thank you for inviting me. I was just wondering if, Samuel, can you put my PowerPoint on the screen, because I don't seem to be able to do it from here. Is it possible?
Right. So I'll do that.
That would be very nice. Just to begin the thing, I think Prasad has highlighted the skeleton very well, and so has Kunal. He has filled in all the gaps. But at least could we begin from somewhere, which is where does this concept of the circular economy come from? Somebody is saying my mic isn't very clear. Is it?
Yeah.
I tried it in the morning. It sounded perfectly okay. Is it any better now? Or is it crackling?
Well, it's not cracking, but I think there's a certain hoarseness, but I think it's fine. Let's just work with it for the time.
Maybe a little louder, maybe.
Okay, I'll try and be less hoarse. It's age catching up with me. So I was just talking about where has this concept come from. And if you can give the first slide, Sunny. There is this Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which no, that's not the first. Okay. Yeah, that's the first one. Thank you. So this is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and this is these are the three things that they say about the circular economy. And I suspect nobody would disagree with them. They sound so nice and welcoming. But the foundation also says on its website that the objective of all this is to sustain growth decoupled from resource constraints. So I would want to ask, whose growth are we talking about here? Because if you look at their partners, 13 of the 16 partners of the foundation are leading multinational corporations who span the economy from automobiles to packaging. So one would like to ask the question, whose growth? From that, we go to the next slide. And you will see that this is the visual presentation of three resources which are critical. That's water, food, and energy. And they are based on these 5 scales, with the cities being at the top and the globe being at the bottom. Now, all the 3 resources are not produced in the city. They come from outside. So clearly, one can ask the question, how are the resource flows taking place? Are they taking place from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom? Whose growth are we talking about? From this, we can go to the next one, which is what are the benefits? This is the foundation, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's presentation. And you will see from the picture on the left that the 6 benefits are products, rewards, designs, systems, and customization. Of course, they don't tell us who will benefit from these. Is it nature? Is it the consumer? Is it the corporation? And this is a question that at least I would like to pose before all of us. If you look at the picture on the right, the question becomes a little clearer because the 4 models are for delivering benefits at refill and return from home, whose home, and refill and return on the go. So who's going? We need to ask those questions which are concealed behind each one of these slides. The next one is an image from the foundation reports. This should help one understand the schema of benefits a little better. It's posed negatively. It's the annual economic value loss, which is there on the left. And if you look at it closely, plastics, 120 billion, that's US dollars. Fashion to textiles, it's $500 billion. And food and agriculture, that's 1,300 billion US dollars. And all these economic value losses can be recovered. But by whom? If you look at, and I think it's instructive to look at the foundation website, it includes Danone, which is a food giant, H&M, which are the clothing behemoths, D.S. Smith, S.C. Johnson, and Solvay, who are huge presences in packaging and chemicals. So who do you think will grow if these resource constraints are removed and these economic value losses can be regained? The next slide shows that in 6 months, the foundation claims, that is from January to August of this year, that they have grown from 0.3 billion to 2 billion US dollars. Now, if I take that as an exponential rate, then the 2,000 US dollars that is supposed to be recovered in the previous slide can be recovered within 2 years. And that's a big amount and a very, very fast rate of recovery. And it might interest you to know that 3 of the foundation partners are multinationals in the areas of finance and big data. There's BlackRock, there's Google, and there's Inessa Sao Paulo. So are they acting purely out of humanitarian motives to save humanity and the earth? Or do they have some other motives? For India, the foundation in the next slide has predicted annual benefits of 30% of current GDP. That's 40 lakh crores. And essentially by using products and materials to their highest utility. As Prasad said, it's greater efficiency. It's not talking about sufficiency. And it is the middle class that is supposed to provide the consumption market for this growth. And it is with the design innovating firms, business enterprises, and logistic companies that are going to be the backbone of this economy. So I again ask the same question I asked earlier. Who therefore is going to benefit? Nature, consumers, or corporations? Now, to answer that, we might have to go. Anil is saying again, a lot of distortion in the sound. I'm sorry, I've got the best mic I have. Is it?
No, but to me, it actually is fairly clear because I'm wearing headphones as well, possibly. So I can hear you fairly clearly. So,
Okay.
yeah.
May I request other people also to use headphones if possible? I'm sorry, I can't change this mic at this time. So, where was I? Yeah. So it might interest you to know where do some of these ideas come from. If we have the next slide, you will see that this is what is called the ring model. It was developed by an economist born in Austria who moved to the US and who began to see the ideas of circular flows. And Schumpeter declared that this is the ring model in which circular flows take place. But if you just take this ring model as it is, this, okay, I'll speak louder. This circular flow remains stationary. If you want it to grow, if you want it to become dynamic, he says you have to disturb it. And who will disturb it is the entrepreneur who innovates. So according to Schumpeter, the prime developer, the prime driver of development was the entrepreneur. And it was therefore necessary for governments to provide incentives for firms to develop new products and processes so that growth could take place. And where would growth take place? At the center of this ring model. You invest at the center, and then the growth radiates outwards from the metropolitan city in the center to the rural periphery at the periphery. This is a model that is of development and it's followed globally. If you look at the next slide, this is the trickle-down theory which accompanied it. It says if you invest in the center, then it will radiate outwards, and within the social pyramid, the investment will trickle downwards. And I think all of us are by and large familiar with these two theories because they operate in our daily lives. It took about half a century to actually demonstrate that Schumpeter's theory was only enriching the investors and the innovators. And this trickle-down theory was first popularized by a comedian, Will Rogers, and then it was adopted by an actor who happened to be the President of the United States at that time, that is Ronald Reagan. And they argued that this is how benefits would eventually reach not only the periphery geographically, but also the periphery socially. The people at the bottom and the settlements at the bottom would eventually get the benefits. It's curious that as you look at this slide, I wonder how many of you ask where that big red arrow in the top is coming from. Is it coming from the heavens? Is it coming from nature? Where is it coming from? And that is a question we need to ask, because these are all the external elements that we often don't see in our presentations. The next slide will show you how India follows this model. This is a map, a development map, if you like, of Hyderabad. And you can see how the radiating outward principle is adopted from the first belt in the center to the fifth belt right at the periphery. And within the third and fourth belt, you will see the secondary centers. And it is these corridors which are promoting the radial growth. So this is a very common kind of map. And I can show you map after map after map of cities all over India, which follow this identical format. Supposing now to this, we apply trickle down and see what happens in those in a three-dimensional map, which I think I showed you in the beginning. So let's see how it applies, except I'm going to invert it in the next slide. So there you are. Those are the three resources, and that is the urban to global 5 layers. And that is the funnel at the bottom. And now if trickle-down theory is applied, resources trickling down from the global level to the urban level and through the social pyramid, who does it eventually benefit? Nature, people, corporations. Now you might think that this is a theoretical question, but let me take you to some more slides to show how it operates in practice. Can I have the next slide? This is a map of Delhi from 1990 to 2007. That's almost 2 decades. It's a map of resettlement. And the dots that you see on the periphery is not where people are coming from. It's where people have been resettled. And they're all coming from the center of the city. You will see that this is how development works. That people are taken from the urban center, evicted, and settled at the periphery. So the question is, why is so much energy being spent in resettling people from the center to the periphery? Is this part of the development pattern that we have seen? And incidentally, why is this land and the energy of human beings who are being displaced not listed in the 3 critical resources that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has put before us? If you take the next slide, it will become more familiar to waste pickers. This is how waste pickers operate in the city of Delhi. It's a map that was made by Chintan, so Chintan would be very familiar with it. And does it or does it not seem similar to the map of eviction of labor? This is the map of eviction of waste. It all collects in the middle of the city, and then it's all evicted to the periphery. It doesn't belong to the periphery, but it's evicted there because the center does not want it. So what happens to the value that waste pickers are creating? Is this part of the development model? And are waste pickers not entrepreneurs? Should they not be at the development node? These are questions that are important because in the next slide, you will see some numbers. This is human energy at work, transporting. Every city has this form of transportation. This is a study that was done, and it was found that the trolleys are regularly seized. They are harassed by the police. They annually pay 200 million, that's Indian rupees, to the municipality, and 900 million to the mafia. Does this compare in some way to the 200 million US dollars that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation began with in January 2020? Do these figures have any relevance? Do they compare with each other? And I'll take you to the final slide on that series. This is a basic item of urban development, it's the brick. And bricks are made in brick kilns. And on the left, you will find the different kinds of workers who are engaged in making those bricks. We did a study measuring how much energy they were expending in an 8-hour day, every day, to make those bricks. And on the right, you will see that kilocalories per day per person. And at the bottom, you will see what is the norm for food intake. And you will also, if you look at closely, see that not a single worker is getting the energy required for working from food. And if that is true, and there are other studies that have been done in this context, then the question really is, where is the value of that energy? And with that, I return to the final question in my next slide, next and last slide. And that is, what will it take to retake the value of products, and for whom, in the circular economy of the city? Is it for nature? Is it for people? Or is it for corporations? Once that question is answered, I don't think it will be very problematic to ask how a retrofitting of the city for a circular economy is to be done, provided we first know what is the objective of that circular economy. With that, I close.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roy, and yeah, for sobering thoughts, I would say. I think the question, the who question, is a fundamental question when it comes to sort of thinking about the circular economy. And there have been several critiques of circular economy approaches because they've actually kind of left the who question out. Who benefits, how much, what are the distributional sort of aspects of a circular economy? And of course, it's not only about sort of the distributions of gains, but also about who are the agents of change, who is driving the agenda, who's sort of blocking progress, who's framing the debates. And it's fascinating because while I was at Sussex on sort of leave from GIZ for a couple of years, I actually worked on a paper which looked at narratives of circularity and who's driving those narratives. And some of the points that you raise actually remind me of my paper as well. But yeah, I'm sure we will talk a little bit more about them. But it's thanks very much for your input. We would like to now move to Manvara Begum. So I'll switch to Hindi so that Manvara ji, आप अपना कैमरा अगर ऑन कर सकें तो वो अच्छा रहेगा, जिससे कि हम आपको देख पाएं और फिर आपसे हम सुनना चाहेंगे कि आपका क्या एक्सपीरियंस रहा है। आप ऑफ कोर्स आप सफाई सेना में काम करती हैं, ये तो हमने सुना हुआ है, और आपने काफी सालों से आप वेस्ट पे से काम कर रही हैं, वेस्ट पे काम कर रही हैं। तो आपसे आपकी आवाज सुनना चाहेंगे और आपसे सुनना चाहेंगे कि आपने लोगों को सुना। मैं थोड़ा सा बताना चाहूंगा कि कुछ जैसे पहले कुणाल कुमार जी ने कहा था कि भारत सरकार में काफी कुछ काम हो रहा है क्लाइमेट चेंज और सर्कुलर इकोनॉमी को लेके, और वो काफी होपफुल है कि आगे भी शहरों में अच्छा काम रहेगा, वो क्योंकि वो सरकार में काम करते हैं। प्रसाद मोदक जी ने कुछ एग्जाम्पल दिए थे कि क्या क्या हो सकता है सर्कुलर इकोनॉमी को लेके, कि भाई जो वेस्ट मैनेजमेंट होता है या कूड़ा को सफाई होती है उसमें क्या क्या किया जा सकता है, कैसे हम लोगों को एक दूसरे के साथ शेयर करना चाहिए जिससे कि ज्यादा सामान हम वेस्ट ना करें। और दुनू रॉय जी ने कहा कि जिनको अभी आप सुन रही थी, उन्होंने कहा कि भाई इस सब से फायदा किसको होता है, अगर अच्छे से वेस्ट मैनेजमेंट हो जाए या कबाड़ी वाला अगर सबकी सफाई करवा दे तो फायदा किसको होता है, नुकसान किसको होता है। और उन्होंने ये भी एग्जाम्पल दिया, जो कि एक चिंतन का एक मैप उन्होंने दिखाया कि सारा का सारा जो कूड़ा है वो शहर का, वो कबाड़ी वाले उठाते हैं, जो कि शहर के किसी कोने में से आते हैं और कूड़ा लेके चले जाते हैं। तो शहर का सारा गंदगी कबाड़ी वाले ही साफ कर रहे हैं, और जो कि शहर के बिल्कुल बीचों बीच में सबसे ज्यादा कूड़ा होता है, लेकिन उसको बाहर फेंक दिया जाता है, शहर के कोने में फेंक दिया जाता है, किसी लैंडफिल में कहीं भी डंप किया जाता है। तो मनवारा जी, आपसे सुनना चाहेंगे आपका क्या एक्सपीरियंस रहा है और आप इस विषय पे क्या बोलना चाहेंगी?
नमस्ते, मेरा नाम मनवारा बेगम है और मैं सफाई सेना की वाइस प्रेसिडेंट हूँ। मैं नेताजी नगर में रहती हूँ। मैं कहना चाहती हूँ, हमारे जो भारत में कम से कम 20 लाख कबाड़ी भाई है, तो उसमें हमारे दिल्ली के सिर्फ कम से कम 1.5 लाख तो है ही। उसमें से कुछ देखो, हमारे जो वेस्ट स्पीकर हैं कम से कम 60 तो है ही, 60% तो है ही वेस्ट स्पीकर हमारे। तो 30 वेस्ट स्पीकर, तो 30 लाख वेस्ट स्पीकर तो समझो हमारे जो डोर टू डोर ही करते हैं, जो घरों से कूड़ा उठाते हैं, ठीक है। और 30% समझो कि साइकिल लेके फेरी लगाते हैं। जो 30% घरों से कूड़ा उठाते हैं, वो 30% जो घर से कूड़ा उठाते हैं वो लाते हैं, फिर अपने घर पे लेके आते हैं, फिर छटाई करते हैं। उनकी कम से कम 50 आइटम तो बनाते ही है वो लोग, 50 आइटम बनाते हैं उनकी, और उसको बेचते हैं, फिर उसको बेचते, छटाई करके फिर बेचते हैं। छटाई करने के बाद बेचते हैं, फिर उनकी घर चलता है, उसी से घर चलता है समझो। और जो हम लोग कूड़ा लेने जाते हैं, वो जो पॉलीथीन में करके देते हैं वो लोग, बांध के जो घरों का कूड़ा उठाते हैं हम लोग, तो उसमें बीमारी भी कितनी होती है उसमें हमारी। जैसे पॉलीथीन में कूड़ा आता है तो उसकी छटाई करते हैं हम लोग, तो उसमें गैस निकलती है, अनेक तरह की कूड़ा होती है उनमें। तो छटाई करने के टाइम हमारे भी अंदर चली जाती है कुछ गैसें, जो हमें खुद को बीमार हो जाते हैं। पेट में दर्द होता है, गैस बन जाती है, सर में दर्द होता है, आंखों में भी जाते हैं हमारे। तो हमारे कोई बचाव की तरह तो है नहीं। सरकार तो ऐसे कुछ सोचती नहीं कि जो ये जो बेस्ट स्पीकर लोग काम करते हैं, इनके लिए कुछ सुविधा हो, कुछ मार्क्स हो, कुछ ऐसी चीज मिलनी चाहिए सरकार की तरफ से।
ठीक
और
है
जैसे हम लोग
मनवारा जी।
छटाई,
हाँ, नहीं, आपने अच्छा बताया। तो आप ये बताइए कि जो आप लोग जो काम कर रहे हैं,
जी
उससे शहरों को आपके हिसाब से क्या-क्या फायदा होता है?
बहुत फायदा है सर।
हुँ, हुँ,
हम लोग जो छटाई करके लाते, कम से कम 30% पूरा तो हम ही लोग उठाते हैं।
हुँ,
जो हम लोग पूरा उठाते, 30% पूरा हम ही लोग उठाते हैं। जो रैम की तुम्हारा ये जो एमडीएमसी वाले हैं, पूरा तो उठा नहीं पाते। पहले हम ही लोग पहुंचते, वो लोग तो गाड़ी लेके बाद में पहुंचते, पहले हम ही लोग पहुंचते, उनकी छटाई करते, उसमें से कूड़े में से कम कर देते हम लोग। वो छटाई करके ले आते हम लोग, फिर हम लोग उस कूड़े को भी फिर हम लोग दोबारा छटाई करते घर में लाके, फिर अलग अलग करके उसको कम से कम 50 आइटम बनाते हैं हम लोग। उसको प्लास्टिक अलग, कागज अलग, फाइल अलग, तुम्हारा पन्नी अलग, ऐसे अलग अलग सारे आइटम, 50 आइटम होते हैं हमारा उसमें। फिर अलग अलग आइटम बेच देते हैं हम लोग उसको। अगर हम नहीं उठाएं तो सरकार को घाटा इतना होगा, जैसे हम लोग जो चीज हम लोग उठाते हैं, फिर उसको रिसाइकिलिंग के लिए आगे चला जाता है। जैसा हम बेच देते हैं, वो आगे फैक्ट्री के पास चला जाता है, फिर उस चीज का फिर समझो कोई भी चीज बन के आ जाती है दोबारा उसमें। लेकिन अगर हम लोग नहीं उठाएंगे तो कूड़े के भाव में कूड़े में ही चला जाएगा, खत्म ही हो जाएगा। फिर वो चीज सरकार का ही घाटा है, वो तो फिर हमारा भी फायदा नहीं है, ना सरकार का फायदा है। जो हम लोग बीन के लाते हैं तो कुछ हमारा भी घर चल जाता है, उस चीज से फिर सरकार को भी फायदा है। अगर वो चीज अगर कूड़े में चला जाएगा और खत्म हो जाएगा, अगर हम लोग वो कूड़े को नहीं उठाएंगे तो सरकार को और ज्यादा मतलब
बिल्कुल, बिल्कुल।
काम
सही
करना
कह रहे हैं।
पड़ेगा, ज्यादा टाइम लगाना पड़ेगा उसमें।
ठीक है, ठीक
हम लोग जो उस कूड़े को उठा के
है।
सफाई करते हैं, उसको साफ सुफ करके उसको बेचते हैं, फिर उसकी रिसाइकलिंग कर लेते हैं। करने के बाद फिर दोबारा उस चीज को फिर दोबारा कंपनी से फिर दोबारा नया बन के आता है, खिलौना बन जाता है प्लास्टिक का, बच्चों का गुड्डा बन जाता है, बैट बॉल बन जाता है, अलग तरीके की सब चीज बनती है। समझो हमारे जैसे हैंडल होता है कपड़ा टांगने का, काली वाली प्लास्टिक होती है जो हम बीन के लाते हैं, वो
बिल्कुल।
हैंडल बनता है। गमला बन जाता है, बहुत कुछ बनता है हमारी, जो पूरा बीन के हम जो भेजते हैं उसके। फिर पेपर को पकड़ लो, पेपर भी तुम्हारा, पेपर हम लोग बेचते हैं, बीन के लाते हैं, बेच देते हैं। वो तो वैसे तो फेंकने में जाता है, कूड़े कचरे में चला जाएगा। तो उसको जो हम लोग बेचते हैं, फिर उसको जाके कोई तो लिफाफा बना देता है जो राशन वाले के पास पहुंच जाता है। पेपर का ये ज्यादातर यूज होता है, लिफाफा बनता है और तुम्हारा बहुत सी चीज बन जाती है, मतलब उस चीज से।
तो अच्छा मनवारा जी, आपने कहा कि आपको सरकार से अगर कुछ मास्क वगैरह मिल जाए उससे आप लोगों को फायदा होगा, पर्सनल प्रोटेक्ट, लेकिन आप लोगों को जगह वगैरह कैसे, आप लोग कहाँ काम करते हैं, आप कुछ?
काम तो हम लोग झुग्गी में रहते हैं, सरकार से बहुत उम्मीद है, जो हमें अगर मिल जाए तो और अच्छी बात है। जो हमारे 1.5 लाख कबाड़ी भाई है दिल्ली के अंदर, उनके लिए जगह अगर मिल जाए तो हमें तो सबसे बड़ी खुशी होगी, जो छटाई करने के लिए। क्यों, हम लोग जो छटाई करते हैं कूड़ा बीन के तो लाते हैं जगह से, लेकिन हम अपने घर के पास ही छाटते हैं। हमारा भी छोटे छोटे बच्चे हैं, बीमारी कितनी फैल रही है, लेकिन हम उन चीजों की परवाह नहीं करते। क्यों, हमें बच्चों को खाना खिलाना है। अगर हम वो छटाई करके नहीं बेचेंगे तो हमारे बच्चे भूखे रहेंगे। तो सरकार से हम यही बोलेंगे कि थोड़ी बहुत हमें वैसी जगह मिले जहां हम डोर टू डोर का काम करते, कॉलोनी में हो, छटाई के लिए हमें ऐसा जगह मिल जाए जो हम वहीं छटाई करके वहीं बेच सके।
ठीक है मनवारा जी, अब हम वापस पैनल के जाएंगे और फिर आपसे सवाल होंगे तो आपसे और सवाल पूछेंगे बाद में। लेकिन अच्छा, सो आई जस्ट, मैं अंग्रेजी में ट्रांसलेट कर दूं क्योंकि विदेशी लोग भी हैं पैनल में, कुछ लोग जिनको हिंदी समझ में नहीं आती, इस देश के लोग भी जिनको हिंदी समझ में नहीं आती है, तो उनके लिए मैं ट्रांसलेट कर दूं कि what she said essentially was well, sort of very eloquent description of what they're doing, and basically she kind of articulated how they're helping the cities well, do circular things without sort of calling them circular, which is sort of essentially how most people who do the right thing actually don't give names to them. But the other point is about sort of a clear demand about the space for segregation. So the large sort of the job creating potential of waste management, the sort of the transformation of waste into useful products, and how they're actually helping cities sort of well, manage this problem without getting too much credit for it, but also a clear ask on the need for space for segregation, which of course was prompted by when I asked her, okay, so what about space? And she said that yeah, it would be great to kind of get the space. So let's try and come back. So if my panelists, Dr. Roy, Dr. Dunu Roy, Dr. Prasad Modak, if they could turn on their cameras, we would then sort of get into the question answer mode now. And I would like to sort of start by sort of asking slightly sort of a broad question, which I would actually start with Dunu. Maybe Arun Bidani's asked this really interesting question. Well, I find it interesting, and I will take the moderator's privilege to point it out to someone I want to. And it's like sort of so he's saying, without disrespect to any of this discussion, I guess he's referring to, I wonder about the world of ideas and creativity in isolated pockets and the world I see around me. So I guess the disconnect between all of this sort of grandiloquent sort of discussion about circularity and about sort of retrofitting cities and the stark reality of our cities. He's talking about sort of the disconnect between the two. Dunu, what do you see about what do you have to say about this?
Well, it's not so much a disconnect. I think there is a deep connection between the two. The disconnect is only at a superficial level, which is you see an image, say, of the smart city of Goran, or you see an image of the smart city, the proposed smart city of Bhubaneswar. And the disconnect is because that image does not represent what is actually happening in Bhubaneswar. But the connect is that, in a sense, there is a transformation that is trying to take place. So there is a world of ideas, there is a world of imagery, which is saying that this is how the city ought to transform itself. Unfortunately, there's another world of imagery and world of ideas. And I think Manwara Begum said that just now, अगर हमको मास्क मिल जाता है, अगर हमको घर मिल जाता है, अगर हमको रहने की जगह मिल जाती, बच्चों की पढ़ाई मिल जाती, तो शहर बदल जाता. How is it that that never comes into policy? That, I think, is the question that needs to be asked.
All right. Thanks very much, Dunu. And yeah, I think that is a fundamental sort of point for discussion as well. That sort of there are multiple narratives about our sort of current sort of multiple narratives which already always exist, and what narratives get priorities, and who's pushing those narratives, and who's benefiting from the pushing of those narratives. I think that's very critical, and very truly that sort of Manvara's points are not the narratives which are the dominant narratives in most discussions, but they ought to be, and they could be transformational. Uh, I think I'd like to now move to this question to Dr. Modak, Prasad Modak. So there's a question about the plastic menace. So I think you've partly answered this, but maybe it would be good if you share that with the audience in general, because I think your answer just came to all the panelists, and it's basically about sort of why is clothing waste not considered sort of a big issue? Why is fast fashion not considered a major culprit? How does India fare on the circular economy index? And what about sort of the plastic menace? Well, we've been talking about the plastic menace, but e-waste is also slowly catching up. So I think it would be good if you share your views on all of these sort of mini questions with the entire audience. Over to you, Dr. Modak.
All right. Actually, I put in my chat box some response, but let me build on these questions. Uh, Clothing waste was first point. So it's not that it is not recognized. It is in the radar. Everybody internationally, nationally talk about it. There's a huge secondary clothing market, very active in our country also, quite a lot. If you go in the morning at 4 to 5 in Mumbai, in certain spots, there's a clothing recycling market. It's huge. It's been there for years. And there are people who are making use of abundant jeans to make handbags out of it, and they're running businesses. This is just one example. But the increasing volume of clothing waste is the worry, which is right. It's fast fashion is one of the reasons people are talking the subject of circular economy in fashion industry quite a lot. We also see a cross-sectoral movement of waste, like the PET fiber, bottle waste getting into fiber, what we call as recycled PET fiber, rPET. And rPET is already in India. People are making fabrics out of the PET bottle waste. So in plastic, again, you do see some cross-sectoral movement happening. There are opportunities. Just to give you an example, the sawdust blended plastic waste related research for railway sleepers started happening in Australia and the UK. And today, the Australian rail is using sleepers made out of the blend of the sawdust and the plastic waste. This is just to give you an example, the way we are talking on the asphalting, but this is highly technical. It is looking at possibilities of as low risk of any recontainment, and structurally the sleepers are acceptable to carry the rail. So you do see definitely attention to plastic differently happening. Sustainable packaging is one area which many of the Indian brand owners and companies I'm working with are moving to sustainable packaging, which is reducing the plastic content again in the packaging. So the problem is, I'll tell you, it's communication. A lot is happening in this country as well to start taking the stock, but it is not reaching all the stakeholders. We need more and more such dialogues. What we're doing today, we need to bring in, I mean, the earlier point also in terms of so-called disconnect. The issue is that people don't see. It's not possible for one person to get an entire overview, right? So you need to really prepare a lot of interesting communication materials for people depending on their interests. And I think that brings us to the role of education and putting some of these circular economy related ideas in simplest words possible. Not make it complicated and then put them also in the education. There's a huge need again for continuing education training in circular economy. Many of the schools you mentioned, Ashish, which I run, in fact, there is one now we're running on circular economy. It's called Academy. But my experience has been extremely positive. People, once they understand what we are trying to say, then they get involved. There was a question also about any financing happening. It's really odd that the state of Rajasthan, in the Rajasthan Pollution Control Board, set up a 5 crore grant fund to support projects on waste to resources, and they hardly could get proposals, good quality proposals for funding. So that's also the case. Whereas you have, since you mentioned plastic, we have very active players from private equity in this country, like Circulate Capital, who are financing all plastic recycling related investments as a private equity holder. So there is a lot which is happening, and a bit of that is you will find in the report which got out from Niti Aayog last year, the 4 sector reports and 1 status report. I think that's something which all of you should see. The term circular economy may take different avatars as you're talking to different stakeholders. You have to really choose what to communicate of the element of circularity. The biggest challenge of all what we are talking is behavioral change. That is the toughest thing. And while we may all discuss in such meetings, how many of us are willing for that behavioral change? That's the challenge. And this behavioral change, because it is overlooked, business models are failing in many cases. Policies are not giving the expected results. So it's you and I, finally, that we have to get ourselves convinced to live that lifestyle. And that's the real, according to me, the disconnect, because we are in different worlds. One in these seminars, and when we finish the seminars, we are back to what we do.
All right, well, that's an interesting sort of twist to the conversation, but I'm sure sort of we can talk sort of a lot about individual behavior as well. But I think when we talk about systems and we talk about systemic change, well, I'd like to come back to Dunu for a question which was raised earlier, but kind of another, and you kind of ended up posing a question back to the audience. So I'll actually like to ask you, what do you think? Who do you think is going to sort of drive this change? So how do you bring the because you pointed to the fact that of course there is the big capital, the equity, the corporations, but if we want to reimagine another future or reimagine another sort of version of a circular economy or closing material cycles or whatever name we want to call it, who do you think is going to drive this change? And what kind of alliances do we need? Do we need alliances? What are those actors who are going to actually be sort of involved in this transformational change? It's a tricky question, but I think you're the best person on the panel to kind of tackle it.
Yeah, it's a tricky question. Since it's a tricky question, I'll kind of throw it right back at the questioner. But I'll add some data that might help to imagine what could be the answer to the question. Firstly, we were just talking about the clothing economy and what can be done. If you go back in this country 50 years, all clothing was recycled, even in our middle class homes. Clothing was repaired. There used to be people called rafukars in every city and town and village who were darning experts, who would expert at repairing clothes. There were women who traveled through cities with baskets on their head, particularly during the time of Dhanteras, and they would exchange saris for vessels. So there is an economy that we tend to forget, and it will never come up in our posters. It will never come up in what Arun Vidani said is the realm of ideas and the realm of imagination. So why is it? Why is that economy being neglected? What has happened? Just as much as the Manwara Begums are ignored, why is it that this whole economy is also ignored? That's one. The second one is we've done some studies, and if you look at globally, what is the carrying capacity? This is what Prasad was also talking about earlier, of sufficiency of resource, not efficiency. Then how much resource is there on the earth for all of us? And if I look at it from the point of view of climate change, the global carrying capacity, this was at the time we did the study, it probably has changed by now. But at that time, it was 1 ton of carbon dioxide per capita, per annum. That is what the earth could bear if temperatures were not to exceed 2 degrees centigrade. This is a calculation that scientists have made. I'll not go into that whole lot, but I'm just taking it as an example. Now, if I take that 2 degrees per centigrade, because there have been a lot of questions in the panel about why don't we segregate waste, why don't we have a criteria for carbon impacts and so on. See, you have to understand that it is not the total emission of India that matters. It is the per capita emission of India that matters. If you take India as a global emitter, as a country, then it's the 4th largest. But if you take it as a per capita, that is how much per person is emitting, then it comes down to the 90th. So which parameter are you going to use? And it is in that context that I want to say that if I look at per capita carbon dioxide emissions in India segregated across classes, then the upper class is emitting as much as the upper class, say, in Saudi Arabia or in the US. But the lower class is emitting about 1/3 of the global level. So when you ask the question, who will modify? Who will drive change? Is it going to be the person who's already consuming 10 times more than the earth can afford? Or is it going to be the person who's currently consuming 1/3 what the earth can afford? That is a question that is very important and we need to ask them.
I'm muted. No, thanks very much for sort of answering the question and posing another question. And I think these are issues that have to be raised. And I would like to kind of we're already 8 minutes over the time, but we started a little late. I would actually like to give the last word to Manwara ji. अगर आप अभी भी हैं, आप अपना कैमरा ऑन कर लीजिए तो हम आपको देख पाएंगे और आपको सुन भी पाएंगे. हाँ, मनवारा जी, आपके लिए भी एक सवाल आया था कि आप तो सफाई सेना की वाइस प्रेसिडेंट हैं, आप बहुत सारा काम कर रही हैं वेस्ट मैनेजमेंट पे. तो जब आप लोगों को कूड़ा मिलता है, आपके पास सबसे सामने आपके कूड़ा आता है, तो उसमें आपको पहला आप ये देखती हैं कि कितना सोर्स सेग्रीगेटेड है, कितने लोग दिल्ली में सोर्स सेग्रीगेट करते हैं, जो इतनी बड़ी बात हो रही है सोर्स सेग्रीगेशन की कि इतना होना चाहिए, 90% होना चाहिए, 70% होना चाहिए, 80% होना चाहिए. तो आप लोगों के हिसाब से जब आपको कूड़ा मिलता है तो आप कितने लोग सोर्स सेग्रीगेट करते हैं और कहाँ पे सबसे ज्यादा सोर्स सेग्रीगेशन होता है?
सर जी, कम से कम मैं 300 घर का कूड़ा उठाती हूँ. ठीक है, उसमें से 300 घर में से कुछ घर तो डालते हैं, कुछ घर बोलते कि फ्री में गाड़ी आ रही रेमकी की, उसमें डाल देते हैं. कितने छटा ज्यादातर नहीं मिलता है, हमें मिक्स ही मिलता है. 100 में से कम 40-50% कूड़ा जो है हमें बिगड़ छटावा मिलता है. ठीक है, तो वो हम क्या करते हैं, पीछे रिक्शा के साइड में बोरा टांग लेते हैं साथ साथ एक घर से लाते हैं और अलग अलग कर लेते हैं हम अपना
तो
जो
कहाँ से, मनवारा जी, आप कहाँ से उठाती हैं कूड़ा जो आप 300?
मैं सर नेताजी नगर में,
नेताजी नगर में उठाती हैं,
जी,
ठीक है।
वहां से डोर टू डोर का काम करती मैं।
हम्म,
तो उसको संग के संग मैं अलग कर लेती हूँ। जो मेरा सूखा कूड़ा है वो छाट के मैं अपने पीछे बोरे में रख देती हूँ और गीला कूड़ा जो अपना रिक्शे में ले जाके डैनफिन में डाल देते हैं।
अच्छा, और अगर आपको ये जो आपने 300 घरों से उठाया है कूड़ा, अगर आपके सामने वो 300 लोग बैठ जाएं,
जी,
उनको आप क्या बोलेंगी कि कल से क्या करना चाहिए?
कल से मैं तो यही बोलूंगी सर कि कूड़ा अलग अलग, सूखा कूड़ा अलग दीजिए, गीला कूड़ा अलग दीजिए। इस वजह से मैं रिक्वेस्ट भी किया, मेरे सफाई सेना की तरफ से एक लेटर भी लिखवाए थे, तो ये लेटर भी मैंने बांटा, लेकिन उन लोगों ने क्या किया, लेटर पढ़ा कि नहीं पढ़ा, कूड़े में दोबारा डाल।
आप लोगों को वापस मिल गया वो लेटर कूड़े में?
वो वापस हमारे पास ही आ गया है। क्या करें?
ओके, ठीक है मनवारा जी, मैंने कहा था कि मैं आखिरी शब्द आपको दूंगा बोलने के लिए, तो आपने
जी,
तो ऑलरेडी कह दिया कि आपको क्या चाहिए, मतलब सरकार आपको सेग्रीगेशन के लिए जगह दे दे, लेकिन अगर आपको अपने भाई बहनों के लिए, जो सफाई सेना के इतने सारे लोग हैं जो कि पूरे दिल्ली का और आसपास की जगहों का कूड़ा उठा रहे हैं,
जी, जी,
अगर आपको उनकी बेहतरी के लिए कुछ मांगना हो सरकार से, तो आप क्या बोलेंगे? आपका क्या हक बनता है?
हम तो यही बोलेंगे सर, जो हमारे जो स्पीकर है जितने, अगर सरकार का कूड़ा उठाना बंद कर दे तो सरकार को बहुत भारी पड़ जाएगा। दिल्ली में पूरा कूड़ा ही कूड़ा नजर आएगा। हमें ये चाहिए कि हमारे जो स्पीकर भाई बहन लोग हैं उनको छटाई के लिए अच्छा जगह मिले, उनको वर्दी मिले, डॉक्टरी इलाज मिले उनको सरकार की तरफ से, और कुछ जैसे जो सरकारी ऑफिसर लोगों को तनख्वाह में मिलता है, जैसे डॉक्टरी कार्ड और तुम्हारा रिटायरमेंट के बाद उनकी सपोर्ट मिलती है, हमें तो कुछ नहीं मिलता सर।
ठीक है,
कुछ मिलता है ना कुछ मिलता,
ठीक
इसलिए
है,
यही कूड़े में
I think her network is getting choppy as well. And we've run out
महाराज
of
जी मर
time.
गया, कूड़े का काम करके पत्थर भी डाल दो, नहीं सर। लेकिन अगर बड़ा इंसान कोई, सरकारी बंदा कोई, तो सरकार तुरंत ये उसके परिवार के लिए पूरा पेंशन उनसन सब मिलता है उनको, लेकिन हमारे लिए तो कुछ भी नहीं है सर। तो हम चाहते हैं कि हमारे जो गरीब भाई लोग हैं, कबाड़ी भाई, उनके लिए कुछ ऐसा सरकार को सोचना चाहिए कि उनको बच्चों की जिंदगी अच्छी कटे, कुछ पेंशन ऐसा मिलना चाहिए, ये खर्चा इतना देना चाहिए जो आगे उसकी बच्ची रोटी पानी करके खा सके।
ठीक है,
क्यों हम कूड़े में बीमार इतने ही पड़ते हैं जो हमारे पास अपने इलाज करने के लिए पैसे नहीं होते। अगर हॉस्पिटल भी जाओ तो दवाई लिख के दे देंगे बाहर से कि बाहर से ले लो, सरकारी बंदों को तो वहीं से मिल जाता है सर, हम जैसे को कहाँ मिलता है।
ठीक है मनवारा जी, थैंक यू सो मच। आपने बड़ा अच्छा क्लियरली बोल दिया कि आप लोगों की क्या डिमांड्स हैं, आप लोगों को क्या हक से मिलना चाहिए। मैं अंग्रेजी में बोलूंगा अब, क्योंकि मैं सेशन को फिनिश करने की कोशिश कर रहा हूँ। सो वेल, many thanks everyone. Sort of I think of course there is no clear answer, there is no sort of silver bullet, as Prasad Modak said in his intervention, that circular economy should not be seen as a silver bullet. As Dunu Roy said, that we actually need to think about reimaginations, about sort of listening to the voices of people like Manwara Begum, who's very eloquently and very sort of poignantly said that they're actually solving the problems of the cities, but they're not getting the credit that they should ideally be getting. Of course, things are changing. I think the narratives are changing. There are new sort of developments, as Kunal Kumar also said right at the very beginning, that he's hopeful that there is a new reality which is going to emerge. And I think what we need to do is really sort of think about, when we start thinking about retrofitting our cities towards a circular economy, what Dunu said about sort of who's going to benefit from this sort of retrofitting, who's going to drive this retrofitting, who's going to push sort of us all in the right direction, and what direction is the right direction. We need more deliberation. So I would actually like to thank Chintan for organizing this in really interesting discussion, and sort of on a Wednesday evening, sort of where Delhi is getting a little chilly. I think we have a little bit of, well, a lot to ponder on in terms of our reimagination of our cities. And when we actually think about retrofitting towards a circular economy, who are the sort of the drivers of change? And Manvara Begum is definitely one of them. So we should salute people like her, and of course get them to voice their opinion, voice their concerns, voice their demands, because the kind of challenges that they face, but while solving the problems of cities, are actually going to be a critical contributor to the circular economy agenda nationally, locally, as well as globally. So with these words, I would like to hand over back to you, Chitra. Thank you very much. And well, back to you.
Uh, Thank you so much, Ashish, for a brilliant moderation of, I think, a very interesting session and extremely interesting discussion. We had some great questions and answers and wonderful presentations. Thank you so much again, and thank you, our great panel. And I would like to close this event by once again thanking all of you and our audience who has taken time, as you said, on a Wednesday evening, on a foggy, almost chilly Wednesday evening, and for joining us. I'd just like to tell everybody that we've completed 5 webinars. We have the last webinar on 3rd December to continue our discussion on circular economy. And this time we'll be talking about the livelihood potential of circular economy and what has it shown us so far. So please do join us for more interesting discussions, and thank you again and have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Bye. Bye-bye.